Here we are back to my methods, and in this, this may be more than one video, certainly will be more than one video, on laying out the pleating for a kilt that's going to be pleated to the set. Now, I don't do as many kilts pleated to the set as I did, mostly because, well, A, I have a military background in which they're invariably pleated to the stripe, but also pleating to the stripe has several characteristics which I and many of my customers find appealing. One of them being that, as I've mentioned in another video, that when we lay out the aprons and then count the repeats of the set, that will give us the total number of pleats. And when pleating to the stripe, we will in fact have that total number of pleats because we're measuring the same distance each time. And pleating to the stripe also gives us the strongest vertical element, which is the most slimming and makes us look taller and blah blah blah. But a customer has decided, he's decreed that he wants his kilt pleated to the set, and I sat down and thought about it for a bit. And of course, it's his decision. That is what he shall have. But sitting looking at it, I had this sort of aha moment where I suddenly quantified to myself what I've been doing instinctively for years, and I wanted to share this with you. I think when pleating to the set, one of the characteristics which will make it or break it is how busy the tartan is. And this is the customer's tartan. It's the Crichton, possibly pronounced Crichton, due to variations in regional pronunciation. I'm going to keep calling it Crichton. And it's a very strong, dignified, simple set. And I think it's going to be a more visually appealing kilt when pleated to the set than otherwise. Say, for example, this, which is the ancient Macpherson, being very, very busy. I think there's so much visual noise here, if you will, that if I was to pleat this to the set, a lot of the appeal would be lost because there's just so much distraction to the eye. But enough about that until we get around to making that kilt. But here we have simple, strong, large set. So what I've done is I started out, because his waist is 34, his hip is 41. I started out just doing what I normally do, which is just split 50-50, 17-inch apron, 17 inches of pleats at the hip. And then from 18-inch wide apron, because I tend to go to a relatively subdued A-line, at least above the fell portion, which of course leaves me 23 at the hip on the pleats, which immediately cheered me up because we want an odd number. Because we want an odd number of pleats, which I will make clear in a minute. So having done that, okay, 17 and 18, so I chalked out the front apron. And I just sort of arbitrarily picked, well, didn't completely arbitrarily, but I just selected a spot here, 1, 2, 3, 4 repeats in from the edge. And I chalked the waist and the hip. Now the length of the kilt is 23.5, which is right there. I'm just doing this very broadly right now, right? Because I do all my marks before I rip the cloth to length, because I've got two. By so doing, I'm not going to lose yarns unraveling as I whip this back and forth. So I laid this out, and then I looked. Here's the right edge of my outside apron, and I thought, well, am I wasting any cloth there? But then I thought, here is the amount that I allow for the folded over edge on the right hand side, a full hand span. Now it falls short, so I'm going to round it up to there. Right, for reasons that I'll perhaps mention later, but I've rounded it up a little bit more. But then I need 2 strips to produce the fringed edge. So I was there, there's a strip, I'm only wasting about 1 inch of cloth. And when we see that the edge is a bit ragged, because this was cut at the middle with scissors, if we look down here, 1 inch, I'm really wasting nothing at all. I'm barely 1 inch. So that's inconsequential. So and then I go to the other end, the inside apron, and I've done the same thing. But because I've already got my material for my 2 strips, I don't need to harvest any off this end. So I've laid it out on the center line, and I'm just gonna round it up to that edge, right? So there we are. Incidentally, the inner apron need not be laid out to the same center line as the front. In this case, it has been, but it's not absolutely crucial that it is. You do want it centered on some aspects of the tartan. It would look really unprofessional if it was just sort of spilling off. We appreciate symmetry, even though when it's not visible in the finished garment. So I could have gone to the center of the field here, but I've gone to that line. And then I've made allowance for an apron pleat, which in this case is about I just sort of eyeballed a quarter of the total width and made a mark. I did the same thing at the other end, a quarter, and I made a mark. And then I counted the number of repeats between these. This is a bit arbitrary. This might be a bit deeper, it might be a bit shallower, but it's an arbitrary place to start. I counted the number of repeats, and I came up with 32 to there, which is also the center of the total 8-yard length of cloth. Now I dropped from 32, I dropped to 31 because again we want an odd number of pleats. If this is the center of my apron, and by the way, if I can't remember if I'd mentioned it before, I pick as the center of my apron the strongest element of the tartan. And often I'll do this with the customer leaning over my shoulder, and I'll just go like this. Does that work best for you? Or does that work best for you? See, because you can get a different subtle but distinctive effect by just moving to a different center. But this is clearly going to be my center, and therefore that spot that I'd marked, that's going to be my center back pleat. It's and because again we need an odd number of pleats because that has to be in the center of the back. If it was an even number, that would be off by one pleat and it would catch the eye and it would not look the least bit complimentary. It would be awful. So having done that, I'm just going to motor through and we'll do all this in one session. So 17 apron, 17 pleats at the waist, 18 apron, 23 pleats at the back. And as I said, we decided, well, it came to 30, maximum of 32, but we're not going to do that. It's going to have to be 31 pleats. So I then mark divisions, 1/2 inch, 5/8, 3/4, 7/8, 1, 31 pleats, 29, 27, 25, 23. Because again, we're going with an odd number. So starting with a maximum of 31. But as I've mentioned elsewhere, and as something that I don't believe is mentioned in the certain kilt-making book, I could be wrong, is that when we pleat to the stripe, we are going to be able to have that maximum number of pleats. But we can't achieve that when pleating to the sett. And here's the reason why. When we pleat to the stripe, we're going the same distance each time, whatever distance this is. It looks about 7 inches or so. It is, in fact, 6.5 inches. Yay me. But when we pleat to the sett, with every pleat, we're advancing 1 unit. And I just arbitrarily took a 1-inch gauge here. But here's, so if this is my first pleat, the second pleat is going to be 1 inch over, and then third is 1 inch over. So in the course of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 pleats, 7 pleats, we're going to lose an entire set. Actually 6 from 1. So in 6 pleats, we're going to lose an entire repetition. In 30 pleats, we're going to lose 5 repetitions. So it's not going to be that 31. Now the cloth just dumped off the edge of the table. And pardon me as I reach past you and get my piece of paper back up again. So 31 is right out. So 31 minus the 5 lost pleats that I mentioned is 27. So then I start working out my pleat widths at using the same measure of counting on the tape that I mentioned earlier. So 1/2 of 27 is 13.5. Well, 5/8 is 16 7/8. 3/4 is 20 1/4. 7/8 is 23 5/8. And a 1-inch pleat, of course, will be 27. I immediately notice, remember my waist measurement is 17. Well, 16 7/8 is only an 1/8 inch difference. And hip of 23, well, 23 5/8. There's a 5/8 difference, but I don't mind a bit of extra room in the waist. In fact, I prefer it actually, because there's a good chance during the sewing process, when we sew in the steek and we press it, that 5/8 might diminish a little bit. So right now, I can see that if I pleat 27 pleats, each pleat is going to be 5/8 at the waist and 7/8 at the hip. Now, I'm not yet ready to take this to the bank, so to speak. So the next stage I'm going to do, now my cloth is a bit messed up because it just slid off the table. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lay it out using my my little wooden piece, which seems to have fallen off the table. We'll just grab another one of a different width, but we don't mind right now. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to that middle pleat that I identified. Let's just find it here, there. And I'm actually going to chalk out, this is 1 3/8, but I'm just doing this for effect. I'm going to chalk each pleat out from the center and determine that what works on paper actually works on the cloth, because it may well be that this doesn't translate to the cloth, that we don't wind up with enough material for that. There it goes off the side of the table again. I'll get it later. It may well be that when I actually translate to this cloth, that I don't have enough material there for that deep pleat, or alternately I have too much for that deep pleat. So this may not survive the acid test, as it were, and I may have to go back to the drawing board again and calculate for 25 pleats, or possibly even 23 pleats. Now the temptation is there, because 23 pleats, 1 inch, dead easy, right? But that would cost quite a bit of cloth that the customers paid for. It would be extra cloth laying on the floor, and we don't want to do that. That's a nasty little trick that I believe, I don't know, but I believe if somebody was making a large quantity of kilts from one roll of cloth and they were anxious to scrimp and save every little bit of cloth, see if they could squeeze one more kilt out of the roll, I could see how somebody could be tempted to do that, but I'm not going to submit to that temptation. We're going to carry on with this. So from this next stage, again, I will sit down with my proper gauge, which vanished over the other table a minute ago, and chalk out the pleats to see if what is theoretical will actually be real. Thank you, and carry on.